Hey, how's it going? Come on in. You remember back in 2018 when my wife Sarah was diagnosed with breast cancer and she had a bunch of surgeries and went through chemo, and that was the same year that I lost two parents. I lost my dad and my stepmom to various illnesses and so on. And ever since that year, there was like this sort of loss of self-discipline that I had. I've just kind of lost the energy to resist giving my body what it wanted, every pleasure that I wanted. But what I found out is that giving my body the pleasure it wanted, it didn't make my wife's cancer go away, and it didn't get my parents back. Justin Earley says, "There will always be a kind of pain you can't soothe by eating." Now, COVID has totally exacerbated this whole thing. Over the last 2 years, we've eaten more, we've drunk more, we've watched more TV, we binge watched more movies, we've smoked more. I know that I've done many of these things way more than I should. We become overall just way less disciplined. It's like the energy that we have to have good habits has totally disappeared. You remember back in the hot vax summer of 2021 when we all had been vaccinated and we stopped doing masks and all that sort of stuff? Well, that summer I started eating out again. I started getting together with friends again, and I put on 15 pounds in 3 months. But even though I was connecting with all these people, I still wasn't feeling better. This reminds me of John's first letter in the New Testament, where he says, "For the world offers only a craving for physical pleasure, a craving for everything we see, and pride in our achievements and possessions. They're not from the Father, but are from this world." You know, I think that we're tempted to believe that if we could just fulfill that craving that we have, if we could just eat that thing or possess that thing or consume that thing, then we'd be happy. But what we found out is that it doesn't fill the hole that's inside of us. These things just leave us more empty than we were before. Before long, we build a habit of giving ourselves whatever our body wants, giving ourselves whatever pleasure we want. These habits have become the way that we live. And in the process, we become the kind of person that just is always fulfilling everything that we want. Actually, the problem is that they don't just not fill us, they leave us more depleted than we were before. Justin Earley says, "We're all living according to a specific regimen of habits, and those habits shape most of our life." Now, Justin wrote a book called The Common Rule, and it's the book that this series is based on. We're calling it a Common Rule Challenge because following this common rule is quite a challenge. Justin was a missionary kid, and he came back to the United States and eventually became a lawyer. In the process, he developed a whole bunch of habits that weren't serving him well, and he had an emotional breakdown, in which case he decided to do an evaluation of his whole life and all of his habits and ended up developing this common rule that he's written this book about. You can learn all about the common rule at the website commonrule.org. But Justin says, what if true freedom comes from choosing the right limitations, not avoiding all limitations? Through this series, one of the key verses from the Bible that resonates with me is Paul's letter to the Romans. Paul is the first missionary of the church, wrote a bunch of letters that ended up in the Bible. And in chapter 6, he says this, "Don't you realize that you become the slave of whatever you choose to obey? You can be a slave to sin, which leads to death, or you can choose to obey God, which leads to righteous living." In other words, I think Paul's saying, listen, if you don't have any limitations, you think you'll have true freedom, but you'll really be a slave to death. If you choose the right limitations, what you'll end up with is a righteous living, a right living, a good life before God. Now, Justin developed 8 habits that make up this common rule. And these 8 habits help us resist certain things and embrace other things. And there's all kinds of ways you can think about these 8 habits, but the easiest categories are there are 4 daily habits and 4 weekly habits. The 4 daily habits are this: kneeling prayer 3 times a day, 1 meal with others every day, 1 hour with your phone off, and engaging scripture before your phone. And then there's 4 weekly habits, which are 1 hour of conversation with a friend each week, curating your media to 4 hours, fasting from something for 24 hours, and taking a day of rest. The 2 weekly habits we're going to look at today are fasting from something for 24 hours and curating your media, or reducing your consumption of media down to 4 hours a week. Now, those are some serious challenges, which is why we've called this the Common Rule Challenge. Resisting consuming everything so that we can embrace something else, it's hard work. But they're habits, I think, that are going to pay off in the long haul for righteous, for right, for good living. Both of these are about resisting what we fill ourselves with so that we can embrace filling ourselves with a love for God and love for others. The first thing I'm going to cover is fasting in general, and then I'm going to cover the habit about curating your media to few hours, because I think that's an example of a kind of fasting. But before we dive into that, I've got a question for you. How much time do you spend consuming, and what kind of person is that forming you to become? Let's talk about that.